Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Cecil. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Aging Research Institute. Welcome to our online Seminars in Aging program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are meeting today, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Firstly, a little bit of housekeeping regarding Zoom. At the conclusion of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you could submit them throughout the seminar using the chat function, which can be opened using the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Today, we'll be hearing from Associate Professor Jenny Waycott. Jenny is an Associate Professor in the School of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, working in the interdisciplinary field of human-computer interaction. Her current research is examining how emerging technologies, such as virtual reality and social robots, are being used to provide social and emotional enrichment in later life. So today she'll be presenting Care and Connection during COVID-19, lessons about the effective use of technology for communication with loved ones in aged care. So welcome, Jenny, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Jessica, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. Okay, so as mentioned in the introduction, my talk will be about care and connection during COVID-19, using technology to communicate with loved ones in aged care. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Wei Zhao and Ryan Kelly, who are both joining us today in the seminar, so they will be able to jump in if they want to add anything to what I am saying about the research, and also to contribute to the Q&A at the end of the talk. So this work is also supported by a grant from the Australian Research Council. And before I go any further, I wanted to add my own acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. At the start of a talk like this, some of you will have heard me talk before, but hopefully there will be new people in the audience who haven't encountered me previously. I like to just explain a little bit about what my disciplinary background is. So a little bit about my academic career. So if you look at going back to the start of my academic career, it started with a Bachelor of Arts majoring in psychology at the University of Melbourne. Fast forward a couple of decades, and I'm now working in the Computing and Information Systems School, which is part of the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology. And I like to put those two extremes up there to say, you know, what is a Bachelor of Arts student doing in the Computing and Information Systems School and working in a Faculty of Engineering? And it's all got to do with this field of research, human-computer interaction. So as Jessica mentioned in her introduction, I work in this interdisciplinary field. And this area of research is all about understanding people's relationship with technologies, how people use technology, how we can better design experiences with technology to improve people's lives. And I very much focus on the human side of that interaction. So I'm very interested in people and how they use technology. So I work in a research group in the school called the Human-Computer Interaction Research Group. And you'll see from this description here that it says we study the next generation of interactive technologies, which we validate in a number of important application areas. And the application area that I focus on is design for aging. So if you're interested in learning more about this work that my colleagues and I do, you can go to that website, which is part of the Computing and Information Systems website. So my current research, so the work I've been doing for the last 4 years, is looking at emerging technologies for enrichment in later life. And by emerging technologies, I've mostly been focusing on things like social robots and immersive virtual reality. So my students and colleagues and I have been looking at how these technologies are being used, particularly in aged care settings, and what kinds of enrichment experiences they provide, and how can we ensure that they're designed, they're used effectively to bring about the positive outcomes that people are aiming to do when they introduce these technologies into aged care settings. And alongside that work, before I talk about that other work, I need to tell you what is motivating me. So the questions that are motivating this body of research are later life can be a time of loneliness and isolation. It's not always a time of loneliness and isolation. It's not a universal experience to be isolated in later life, but for those who are isolated in later life, it can be quite a devastating experience. And social and communication technologies could potentially provide benefit for people who are experiencing that isolation. So they could provide companionship, care, and connection. And that's why people are interested in looking at some of these technologies in the aged care space. But we need to ensure that they are designed and used effectively. So we need to make sure that they provide the benefits that are being promoted, and that they don't create burden or frustration or negative experiences. So this is just a bit of a background to the broader area of work that I'm doing and the broader motivations of that research. Now, in order to provide, I guess, a baseline of understanding of what's going on in aged care in terms of technology used for social and emotional well-being, social and emotional enrichment, I conducted a study in 2018, 2019, looking at what current practices were. So looking at what are the motivations for staff introducing technology into aged care settings, what were the main opportunities for these technology-mediated activities, and what were the key challenges. And so that work was happening in 2019 predominantly. And from that work, we identified a really key lesson, which is that it's not about the technology, it's about people. That might seem obvious to those of you who work in aged care, but it was a really strong finding that was coming out of those interviews, that it didn't really matter how innovative and how novel the technology was. What really mattered was how effectively it met people's needs. So it was all about identifying people's needs for communication and connection, and ensuring that whatever solutions were provided to meet those needs were well aligned with people's interests, needs, and values. So that work is currently under review, so it's not actually published yet, but we were analysing data from that research when the world changed. And of course, COVID-19 happened. So all of a sudden, the use of technology for communication for social purposes in aged care, especially in residential aged care, became quite an urgent issue, because without technology, there was no means for people living in residential care in particular to be able to interact with people outside of their care homes. And it was impossible for people with loved ones in aged care to stay connected with them. And so we know that COVID-19 has been particularly devastating for aged care, and especially in residential care, where restrictions had to be put in place so visitors could no longer be allowed, and social programs also had to be stopped. And this meant that aged care providers started to introduce technology-based communication tools, ranging from fairly simple tools like this idea of sending virtual hugs to loved ones that Benetas introduced, and the video conferencing tools that all of us were getting used to, like we are now, using Zoom. It's got a mind of its own at the moment. So what happened is that suddenly aged care providers were having to use technology in order to provide that social and emotional enrichment for their residents who were otherwise cut off from the world. And this provides an opportunity to understand what kinds of experiences people had in using the technology, and how we can draw lessons from those experiences to improve practices in the future. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on the use of video conferencing in aged care. So video calls or video conferencing, things like Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp video calls, to connect family members with loved ones in aged care. So this, the work in this area has, other research has been done previously, looking at video conferencing in aged care and identifying that there are challenges. So this study by Wendy Moyle and colleagues, conducted in Queensland, I believe, concluded that without adequate staff assistance, video conferencing via iPads may be challenging for an older population in long-term care. So we know that there are challenges, but with so many aged care homes introducing video calls last year, there's an opportunity to gain a better understanding of those challenges and also the opportunities that this kind of communication might provide in order to identify lessons for future good practice in this area. So that led to the current study that I'm going to be talking about today. Care and connection in COVID-19. What are the challenges and opportunities of using technology for communication in aged care during COVID-19 restrictions, and what are the lessons for future practice? So we've been conducting 2 interview studies. The first interview study has focused on staff members. So this is very similar to the interview study that I was conducting prior to COVID-19. So I've been working with my research assistant, Wei Zhao, who has been conducting most of these interviews. So far we have 14 participants, and our participants are care staff working in aged care and also IT providers who are going into aged care and providing technology. So our participants are working in different roles in aged care, so ranging from lifestyle, social program coordinators, to providing IT support, to providing the business management side of things. And our participants come from both residential and home-based care services. So in today's talk, I'm focusing on residential care, but we do have some reflections from participants about their experience of supporting people outside of residential care. So aged care clients living at home who also needed access to technology for social purposes and needed IT support to help them engage with technology. But that's the topic of another talk. And then this is complemented by another interview study that we are conducting. So my colleague Ryan Kelly is conducting this study. So Ryan has been interviewing family members who have been communicating with loved ones in aged care. So far, we've had 8 participants take part in this study, and the work is still ongoing. And our participants include both people who lived fairly locally to the aged care home where their family members were living and previously did visit those aged care homes in person. But we also have participants who are living at a distance from their parents in aged care. So they have parents overseas who are in an aged care home. And so their experiences might extend beyond the time of restrictions in place due to COVID, but they certainly have a lot of insights to share about how effectively video calling works when communicating with their loved ones. So the next few slides, I'm going to present some initial findings. Now, I want to emphasize that this is very much work in progress. So we're still collecting data, so I haven't had a chance yet to do a really in-depth thematic analysis. So normally I would do a thematic analysis of the interview data and identify key themes. But what I'm going to do in the next few slides is just show you some of the things that are coming out from our interviewees' reflections, both the staff members and the family members, about the challenges, opportunities, and lessons for future practice. And in the next few slides, I'm going to present quotes from the interview. So I apologize that the slides are going to be fairly text heavy, but as a qualitative researcher, I feel like personally, I find it quite valuable to draw on people's lived experiences, their stories about their experiences. And so I think that that's a good way of understanding some of the issues, some of the barriers, and also the opportunities. So the first challenge I want to talk about is, I mean, it's a really significant challenge, and it's one that probably will be very familiar to those working in aged care. And that is that video calls can create confusion. And unfortunately, they can create such substantial confusion for people in aged care, especially people with dementia, that it may not be possible to continue using this mode of communication. So this quote comes from a participant who was basically unable to continue communicating with her mother during the COVID-19 restrictions. So she actually she said she was cut off from her mother for 18 months. This participant lives in regional Victoria, and her mother is at an aged care home 30 kilometres away. So normally they would have a lot of face-to-face in-person communication. And the reason it didn't work is because of the confusion. So she couldn't understand what was going on. She wouldn't interact with it. She wouldn't look at the screen. If she saw herself on it, she'd just be staring at that and trying to figure out who that person was. We couldn't really get her to engage at all. She was better at engaging in person. It just wasn't the same. And so I started with this one because it's a really significant challenge, and I don't have an answer to this challenge, but just to highlight that it's not a simple matter of putting video conferencing tools into aged care and enabling people to connect. It's a very sensitive setting with very complex needs, and we need to think very carefully about the best ways of enabling communication for people in aged care. And just adding to that challenge, another participant talked about, this is a staff member who talked about the difficulties that family members had communicating with the clients in her aged care home. So even though they can see, they weren't really focusing on the screen. And so they weren't responding to the family. And the family, they're trying to get a response out of the residents. And the residents, for whatever reason, is not able to react the way that the family wants. So there's this experience of quite a difficult communication and sort of tension in the way that the communication occurs. And part of the reason for this is that they just aren't able to engage in that touch-based communication that you would engage in if you were in person. So they weren't able to interact with their loved one the way they would if they were holding their hand. There's also no opportunities for, any other reassuring touch on the shoulder or any other communication in that way. And unfortunately, when it's just conversation and that person is in a screen, it doesn't always work. It sometimes works, but it doesn't always work. And so what she's saying here is that when you strip away all those other forms of communication that go on in an in-person environment, you're just getting the person and the person communicating, and it can be quite difficult to manage the reactions and responses and to steer the conversation in a way that you normally would. Related to this is that the calls between family members and people in aged care needed to be carefully timed to ensure that they took place at a time when the person in aged care was open to communication and able to take part in that conversation. So here the interviewer asked, how often do you call your mother through WhatsApp? So this is a family member responding to this interview question. And she said, I can't call her. They call me when she's okay. It depends on the moment, on her mood. Sometimes she's not in the mood, so they know when to call. Usually it's once a week it happens. It has happened twice a week, and sometimes nothing in 1 week. So it's very variable in terms of when this person's loved one is available to talk to her. And this participant is one of our family members who was using video calls to communicate with a parent living overseas. So her mother was actually in an aged care home in Italy. And that issue of having to time the calls calls carefully highlights too that there is this need for careful care staff facilitation. And so I've got a few quotes about this. This is one of the key challenges, that the video calls can only happen if somebody is there supporting that call to happen. So one family member said, I think the fact that the staff had to be involved as well, it was obviously time consuming for them. So this is the same family member we started with, who was unable to continue using video calls to communicate with her mother. And so the need to involve the staff was a barrier that made it difficult to persist with that form of communication. I guess knowing that someone else was there, it was always a little bit uncomfortable, but there really was no other option. I thought it was great that they offered it. So it was great that the care home had that available, but it didn't really work for our situation. And so I think it's interesting that she is reflecting on that sense of discomfort at having somebody else present for that during the conversation. And that contrasts a little bit with some of our other participants' reflections. It contrasts with this participant's reflections, actually. So this is our participant who was communicating with her mother in Italy. And she talked a lot about the role of the carer, and a particular carer who worked with her mother and was there during those conversations that she was having. So during the conversation, Emma is a facilitator. Sometimes when my mother is not concentrating on the call, she calls her, she reminds her, you know, we are talking with your daughter. Come on, don't look there, look here. She helps a lot. So she helps to kind of steer the conversation in that direction. It's really very important, this person, because she repeats to my mother my words and the opposite. So I can't hear my mother properly. She whispers, and the care staff interprets and repeats the conversation to the daughter. So she really plays an active role, not just in helping to use the technology, but in helping that communication to happen. Another family member reflected on what happens when the staff member doesn't stay to participate in the conversation and to help throughout that engagement. The staff are not available to help too much. They'll help get you set up. So they'll help get things going at the start, but you very often find that they'd go away and leave him. And I would end up looking at the ceiling because the iPad would fall over or something like that. And all I could see was the ceiling. And then he'd say, can we finish this? So that was the end of it. So she's describing a very unsatisfactory experience here that with active involvement of a facilitator could have been a more positive experience. Another comment on the care staff facilitation comes from the perspective of the staff members. So I'm using the notation S to indicate staff member participants. So if someone wanted to FaceTime their family, we would have to do that for them. They couldn't do that for themselves. So their use of that technology was very limited. We had to help them with that. We couldn't leave the technology riding around and expect them to pick it up. It's just not possible. So the use of technology by our clients is a seriously limiting factor in delivery of any technological solutions that we have. And so you can see that there's resource constraints at play here. Staff just don't have time to provide the kind of facilitation that's needed. But there's also issues around staff training. So whether staff have the skills and the confidence to provide that digital support. And one of our staff members that we spoke to did talk about a training program that they had to engage their staff to become digital coaches, but that didn't always work as expected. So we've talked about some significant challenges. What were the opportunities? There were opportunities. There were some positive aspects to this form of communication. The first opportunity is when introducing technology in aged care for family communication, it suddenly became possible to engage with family members who wouldn't normally be included in some of the care providers' activities. So this quote refers to so this is not a one-on-one communication example. This is actually about using technology to ensure family members are able to participate in a group meeting. So you'll have what they call resident relative meetings, which are where you get a group of residents together. Relatives can come along to the meeting and you talk about stuff. What we did during COVID is we had a room set up where the residents were on camera and we gave all family members links to that meeting. And one of the things that we found really interesting is that you'd have family members that were in other parts of Australia who could now attend these meetings. And that's one of the things we'll continue now. So this was a positive outcome where using technology provided an opportunity to bring a broader range of family members into these meetings. Another thing that one staff member talked about was creating Facebook pages to enable family to know what was going on, so to give them a daily glimpse into what's going on in the home. If you don't know what's going on, you can start to think of all sorts of things, so that creates anxiety and worry about how people are managing. And it's one of the things. It's one thing telling you on the phone. So it's one thing for a staff member to say to a family member, everything's fine, your mum's doing fine. But actually, if you can see that life going on inside, it can really help people. So there was an opportunity to expand the use of technology to involve family members more in the life of the home. It also works in the other way as well. So one of our family members provided an interesting observation that when he would visit his father in person, he would be going into his father's world, going into the care home and meeting his father in that environment. But when they were communicating via video call, his father was able to step into our world, step into his world. So the video call provided the father with a glimpse of life outside of the care home, life with his son and his grandchildren. And given the father is not as mobile, that's probably been really good for him to be able to see, because he might have otherwise missed out on that. And this certainly links back to the earlier work that I've been doing, where the technology and things like immersive virtual reality, which I mentioned earlier on, really does provide people with an opportunity to kind of virtually leave the care home. And that can also happen through video calls like Zoom and Skype and so on. There were some really interesting reflections on the value of the visual communication. Now, of course, in-person communication is visual, but what we had also is people comparing the video calls with audio phone calls. So adding that visual layer to the conversation and the impact that could have on what people noticed and the sense of reassurance about somebody's well-being or concern about their lack of well-being. And this is a particularly interesting example from one of the interviews that Ryan did with family members, where the family member actually, the son who was communicating with his father in the United States, actually realized that his father wasn't well and was probably affected by COVID-19. So essentially, I just got the sense that he wasn't well, probably based on how he looked, how he was physically presenting on the video, as well as how he sounded. But a lot of it came just from his visual appearance. He just didn't look well. And so the son actually had to contact the staff and say, look, something's not right. Can you please test him again? And they finally did have a closer look, and he was eventually taken to the hospital and treated for COVID-19. So that's an extreme example, but there's also other participants also talked about that sense of being able to see what was going on through the video communication. So seeing him on video is reassuring, and you can get some idea about how he is. He's not very good at telling you about the problems. So seeing him is quite important to pick up on things like, that's not working. Where's your hearing aid? Where's your phone? Just noticing things that are not quite right in the environment and being able to ask him and get a nod, or he tends to mouth no. So there's non-verbal communication that's happening that is being picked up by the video call. And it's pretty crucial for us to be able to communicate with him, to either see him in person or see him on video. Ideally, seeing him in person is best, but video is really important for us. So it is an alternative to the in-person contact. It's not a perfect alternative, but for some people, it does provide that level of reassurance. Now I'm going to spend a bit of time on this example because it's I found this one quite compelling in terms of how to make video calls effective when communicating with a loved one with dementia. So this quote comes from a staff member who took part in our interviews as a staff member, but she also had her experience as a family member. So she was actually talking here about her use of YouTube with her father. And so she does video calls with her father on a regular basis. Her father lives overseas. And she also uses YouTube quite extensively as a focal point for communication in the aged care home as well. And here she talks about using YouTube on a one-on-one basis with him, very flexibly in terms of what he's interested in at the day, what his mood is like on the day. Sometimes he can direct what we do, and other days I just put things on to support him, just to jog him into the right mind. I literally would just sit and type in whatever it is that we're talking about, whatever it is that engages him, that he wants to talk about. So she'll have YouTube on display on the shared screen, and she'll just look up anything that that is coming up in their conversation. And she said, when you have your screen not in full mode, so you've actually got a menu of options down the side, it creates interest for whoever you're talking to. They go, oh, look at that. So what she's saying here is that with not just the video or the photograph that's on display at the time, but there are other options there for them to see. They might be distracted, or they might want to direct the conversation towards those other prompts. And she said that worked really well with her father. She said by the end of the call, we may have ended up doing something totally different than I'd planned to do. He's normally relaxed and making jokes by the end of the call because we've been in a space that he can contribute to, because you've got those visual prompts. And so that idea of having that shared visual experience that her father was contributing to and directing was really important in this particular example. So drawing on those examples that I've shown you, I'm going to just identify 3 lessons for good practice in the future. The first lesson is not at all surprising. It's that careful staff facilitation is crucial. So we know that for this sort of communication to work well in an aged care setting, it needs active involvement of staff members. But it's not just a matter of having staff members available and having the resources, which is a significant barrier at the moment, especially in Australian aged care, having the resources for staff members to provide that one-on-one attention. But going beyond that, there also needs to be a really kind of sensitive a connection between the staff members and the family. So we saw some contrasting examples of family members who felt it was intrusive to have a staff member present during the conversation, and other family members who felt that active facilitation during the conversation was really crucial, and that actually built up a bit of a bond with that staff member. So it's not just a matter of supporting somebody to use the technology, but it's a matter of supporting somebody to have a positive experience and a positive communication engagement with their family members. And of course, that raises issues of ensuring that staff members have adequate training, both in those digital skills of being able to use the technology, confidence in using the technology, and the capacity to really support the conversation. So second lesson, just drawing on that last example that I shared, is that a shared experience is possible. So we can creatively use technology to provide that shared experience. Visual and audio prompts can enhance the conversation. So YouTube, other participants talked about photographs, so using photographs to direct the conversation and to provide a focal point, and music. I also suggest that games could potentially provide an opportunity for playful connection, depending on the interests of the people involved in the engagement, and of course depending on their ability levels. the benefit here is that this can get around that challenge of the awkward communication where it's just one-to-one and it's just the screen with the person, and there's no other way of kind of reassuring somebody that everything's okay and that you're there. And it could potentially distract people from that confusion and distress that they might experience. And that relates to this last lesson, which is that visual communication can be powerful. So we saw some examples where visual communication was really important, but it can also be confusing. And so, you know, the opportunities are that you can see somebody's facial expression, you can take the person into the home life and environment that you're calling them from, but this needs to be carefully managed in case of confusion. So an example would be hiding the video image of the self so that they're not confused by looking at their own image on the screen. And in some cases, it may be that alternative modes of communication need to be explored, and that's an opportunity for future research, and possibly people have already, so we saw before the example of Benetas providing virtual hugs, and it may be that there are a lighter weight communication alternatives that could be explored for using technology for that connection in aged care. So that's the end of my talk. I'm going to just bring up the title slide again and just emphasize again that I want to thank my colleagues, Wei Zhao and Ryan Kelly. They're both here today, and so they might jump in to take part in the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. That was a fantastic presentation. So now we have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them now through the chat function. Alternatively, if you'd like to ask your question in person, you can turn on your camera and microphone and we'll call on you in turn. Jenny, perhaps you'd like to stop sharing your screen and we might be able to see everybody a little bit more clearly. Hey, thank you. All right, so we have a question from Rania. He says, great presentation of findings, Jenny. Regarding web video communication, what about those with sensory impairment in addition to dementia? Macular degeneration rates are quite high, therefore visual impairment, as in deafness in this population group. Do you know what happens in these cases?
That's a really, really important question. So thank you. I haven't, as I said during the talk, this is a work in progress and I haven't had a chance to really dig through the data and really do a thorough analysis. But I think looking for those, how people dealt with challenges involved in sensory impairments would be really important. I know for people with visual impairment, quite often things like smart speakers are highlighted as potential opportunities there. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of work going on in that space, looking at audio communication in aged care and the use of smart speakers. In terms of deafness, I am not sure. I haven't looked at that in particular. So I think there's definitely there'll be information out there about how to best manage communication when there are sensory impairments. At the moment, most of the material that I've looked at in the data that I've gathered has been about the confusion related to dementia, but I think we can have a look through that, the interviews, to look for how people have got around sensory impairments. Wei, did you have anything to add to that? I can see you there.
Yeah, we did have a few participants mentioning about not only for sensory impairment, even for a later stage of dementia, it's very hard to engage them in video calls. It just doesn't make sense to them having your families in a computer. So that can be more confusing sometimes for them rather than face-to-face visits. So that's possibly a challenge of using video calls in aged care.
Thank you. Bryony asks, or she says first, Jenny, thanks for the presentation. How much do you think the barriers are cohort related, i.e. a cohort that's not digitally literate rather than the technology itself?
That's a really interesting question, and I would have to speculate in response. I guess one of the things, it's not, I guess the technology, it's not just kind of using technology and knowing which buttons to press. It's also about understanding what's happening when you're seeing somebody else on a screen, and just the concept of that video communication being something that is, you know, something that happens and that you're used to, much like television. You know, television, as far as I know, doesn't cause confusion when it's used in aged care, because people go into aged care homes knowing what television is, although I have had interviews with some staff members who've said that they have to avoid showing people news and some television programs when people have difficulty understanding the difference between reality and what's real and what's not real. So I think as in the next few years, as people who are used to video conferencing are going into aged care, it may be that it's much easier to manage because it's something a kind of communication that people are used to experiencing. So that could certainly be a factor. It's very hard to know for sure, because the challenge that I see in talking about digital literacy and older adults is that technology is constantly evolving and constantly changing, and there's always new things coming along. And it's even if you have lived with technology for a long time, and even if you were a technology pioneer earlier on, you can still feel flummoxed by what's available now and what's being used now. So yeah, it's a bit of a difficult one to know. People often say it will all be better soon when technologically literate people are entering aged care, but we may still find that there's a lot of challenges that people still encounter.
Thank you. So you mentioned in your speech that there were barriers to upskilling care staff with technology training. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, so it's a common, look, I struggle with this because it's a common concern that people working in aged care may not, are not always digitally literate and don't always have the confidence in using technology. They also don't have the time to learn to do things, and to learn to do them, you know, to learn to do them in a sensitive and careful way. So there's a common perception that aged care staff require more digital literacy, digital training, and that's certainly something that could be included more in the training that's provided to people going into aged care. I'm actually, I've got a colleague who knows this area a lot better than I do, and I don't think she's here today, but the aged care workforce training is not my speciality, but I know that there are people looking at that and looking at what can be done to ensure people have digital literacy and just the confidence in using the technology so that they are able to help somebody else to use it. Yeah, but it's challenging because not everybody feels comfortable in that space.
Yeah. And I've just got one that I'm personally curious about. You mentioned that Benetas were doing virtual hugs. What's involved in a virtual hug?
I actually don't know. It was something that the Benetas promoted on their website early on last year, and but I think it was just a sort of a quick message rather than a synchronous communication. I think it was more of a non-synchronous message. I don't know if anybody else in the audience knows more about what Benetas did with their virtual hugs.
I'll have to look it up. It sounds very cute. We have another question for you. How much of the issues with staff is related to having dedicated time to enable them to focus on connecting family with their loved ones in aged care?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah. How much of the issues with staff, so care staff facilitation, is related specifically to them not having dedicated time to be able to enable this?
I think a lot of it is related to not having dedicated time. Yeah, I think that's a key barrier, and it's a key barrier for using technology effectively in aged care across the board. So it's one of the key questions that I had from the previous research I was doing, which was which identified that person-centered approach was really crucial for ensuring technology was used effectively and provided that sense of enrichment and personally meaningful activities. In order for that to be achieved, it really requires significant one-on-one attention from people working in aged care, and that the time available for that is just not there. So it's a significant barrier, I think, and it requires a solution that involves changes to the way aged care is run.
Yeah, the follow-up question to that was, what role could volunteers play? High school students, university students, or community members?
I can answer that question. From the staff interview data, we found that another difficulty during COVID is that volunteers cannot enter the aged care settings because of the restrictions, which volunteers are normally the group of people who are providing the social interactions with the residents. They are a major part of talking with the older people and deliver some services, also helping them to use technologies. So that can also be a challenging part during COVID.
All right, thank you for that. We have an update from Jean, who says that Benetis had families convey personal messages to residents, a bit like a telegraph service. Nice.
And yeah, thanks for that, Jean. And I just saw an update from Bryony as well, saying that technology solutions can be seen as being the answer for inadequate staffing, but actually more staff are needed to help the older person use the technology. Yes, that's exactly it. So we often hear this argument that technology is going to make things more efficient, that it's going to solve the problem or the burden of care. But if it's going to work well, it needs more staff time, not less. So yeah, I think that's a really key issue.
Great. Well, if there are no more questions for Jenny and her co-authors, could everyone please join me in thanking her with your clap reactions?
Thank you.
So next week, we're going to be hearing from Stephanie Garrett, who will be presenting It Is What It Is, Medication Administration and Decision Making in Residential Aged Care Homes. So please join us next week on Tuesday, the 10th of August at midday. And thank you very much for attending our Seminars in Aging program.